So one thing we've talked a lot about on the show is that the Chinese Communist Party considers itself at war with the United States. Judging by what you're saying about this being a genocide against Americans, is this just part of the Chinese Communist Party's warfare, or do they have this kind of genocidal intent? Is there a difference there? Especially when this Chinese Communist Party is actively waging ethnic cleansing against groups like the Uyghurs.
Sorry, are you asking, Chris, is this strategic or is this just genocide for fun?
I mean, ¿por qué no los dos?
I think that it can be seen as part of the weakening of America, economic weakening of America, the population, the weakening of the population. It also feeds into China's trope or story that the U.S. is addled with drugs and has a drug problem, and we're degenerates. They want to present themselves as squeaky clean and more responsible than Americans. So this feeds into their whole story about themselves, their propaganda efforts. So I think it's just part of. They see it as, it could be retribution for the opium wars of the 19th century.
That was the Brits.
Yeah, well, I think they dislike the Brits in the United States and Australia. The whole Five Eyes coalition is, along with Japan, are sort of leading the charge against China right now. Europe is much more friendly to China than the Five Eyes group. I mean, there are members of the Five Eyes that are soft on China, like New Zealand, and right now under the Labour government, Australia as well. They've got their trade minister now, pounding the pavement for more China business. But in general, I think that, China and Russia see the United States and Britain as the major impediment to their rise.
Well, that brings us to Taiwan, I think. One of the issues is, as you mentioned, with the fentanyl crisis and everything the Chinese Communist Party is doing against the United States, there seems to be a lack of action on the part of the U.S. government. And in the case of Taiwan, China has been repeatedly harassing Taiwan with military incursions, but the U.S. still hasn't sanctioned, at least that I know of, a single PLA official in response. Since Taiwan is such a critical, really the front lines of this battle with the Chinese Communist Party, do you think the U.S. is really showing Taiwan support?
I don't think we're showing enough support for Taiwan. Since 1979, when we switched our recognition over to Beijing, that was a signal for the whole world to do the same thing. And it was a moral and ethical mistake. And it's led, I think, to some of the major problems that we have in terms of also letting China into the UN, into the Security Council seat rather than Taiwan, which previously occupied that seat. And so it puts, mainland China and Russia in this powerful position to veto anything, any kind of coordination against their territorial aggression. Makes that very difficult. And it's shifting the political and economic resistance against that aggression to forums like the G7, the European Union, Five Eyes, AUKUS, the UK-Australia alliance, the Quad with Japan and India. So these are new forums that are rising, in part because the UN is just, hamstringed from the perspective of resisting China and Russia.
Well, so it's interesting because the UN is supposed to serve as this sort of post-World War II, I wouldn't say international government, but, it's supposed to prevent one country using unilateral power. But if the UN really is not doing its job to prevent Chinese aggression against Taiwan, do you think the United States needs to step up and do more? Or does the U.S. still need to work within this sort of international system?
Well, I think we should recognize that Russia and China have actually violated their agreements, their initial agreements with the UN in terms of respecting the territorial integrity of other countries, respecting human rights. The UN Declaration on Human Rights of 1948 includes support for elections and democracy. Both of those countries signed the UN Human Rights Declaration, but are violating it in spades.
What are you talking about? Putin keeps getting reelected because people love him.
Xi Jinping was unanimously reelected.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing.
That's one way to describe them, yes.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a true democracy, right? China has a true democracy with Chinese characteristics, I guess, and so we can't dispute that.
Like, that's literally one of their arguments, right? Which is that they say they have a superior democracy.
Yeah, they have a democracy. Their conception of human rights is better than our conception because it focuses on economic development instead of all these other problematic political rights. So yeah, I mean, this is their story, and they're they're going to take it all the way, and they're going to stick to it. They're masters of propaganda in this sense. In another sense, they're so ridiculous with their propaganda. But a lot of people on the street won't necessarily understand that. I mean, you can have very smart people who are left-leaning who will fall for Chinese propaganda in the United States, including in the United States.
Well, it's very interesting propaganda to switch to, change the definition of human rights to be economic development. Because as you mentioned, to like an American on the street, that might sound reasonable, right? Like, if you can afford a home, that's important for human rights. But it's interesting because the party can use this as a cover for actual genocide, like when they go into Tibet or in Xinjiang. We'll use the Uyghurs as an example. They're helping human rights by putting all these Uyghurs into vocational training camps so they can get jobs. That's human rights. If, 2% of the population of those camps gets their organs harvested, but they're developing the...
Yeah, but other people have a right to get those organs.
That's true. But this is very clearly like how they are using economic develop as a way to actually cover up atrocious human rights violations.
Yeah. I think one thing to look at when it comes to human rights, and Americans, by and large, also don't always do this well, is there's kind of two types of human rights. And the fundamental core of human rights as laid out in the Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution is actually not things the government will do for the people, but rather things the government is restricted from doing. So, the right to freedom of speech and the press and religion and the right to petition the government. The Congress shall pass no law abridging these rights. So Congress cannot restrict people's natural right to do these things, right? So this kind of right is a restriction on government power. The Communist Party definition of rights has no clause for restricting the government's or the party's use of power. In fact, many of these so-called human rights are in fact implicitly giving the Communist Party power and authority. So if it's a right to be lifted out of poverty, then you're essentially implicitly giving that regime the right to collectivize money or resources and then use those for a part of the population. And whether or not they actually, their policies are truly lifting people out of poverty or people are lifting themselves is a separate argument. But I think it's an easy trap to fall into, like putting everything under the aegis of rights. But in fact, the most important part of the rights, which is a restriction on government power, you're not seeing any of from the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah. And their claims, I mean, their fundamental claim of economic development, they often say how they've raised 800 million people out of poverty. But compare China's GDP per capita to Taiwan or South Korea. And the paucity of their wealth is very clear immediately in terms of, when you make comparisons. And the other point is that all of their data is self-reported. How do we know that that's true? It's probably not, judging by all of their other wild claims. Often the Western press will, report China's GDP growth as this astounding number, over 5 or sometimes over 10%, which is like astonishing. And they also claim uncritically that the Belt and Road Initiative includes $1 trillion of development funding globally. Well, most, if not all of that, is actually loans at high interest rate with unreasonable repayment schemes. It's collateralized with things like ports and natural resources. And the agreements are secret. Some of those agreements may also include bribery of high government officials. Patrick Ho of CEFC, China Energy Group, was convicted in U.S. court for some of these things.
Wouldn't you argue that it's a human right to be able to get a bribe or to take out a predatory loan?
I guess that's their argument.
I just have to say I'm nervous about your jokes, Matt. After you made a joke about the CIA doing a regime change in India, and people in India took that like you meant it. So, just for anyone watching, Matt is not saying bribery is okay.
Yeah, this is just a joke show.
But you can tell my jokes are funny when we all have to clarify that it's a joke.